Alright, so I got an update here for you guys on the CHIPS bill, and honestly, this story that we're about to get into here was pretty much the most predictable thing that anybody with half a brain could have seen coming from a mile away, and is in fact exactly what Bernie Sanders was warning us about in regards to this piece of legislation called the CHIPS Act. So just as a reminder, in theory, this bill was essentially supposed to incentivize some of these tech manufacturing giants like Intel to bring back manufacturing of semiconductors to domestically produce them here in the United States and create thousands of good-paying, stable jobs for the future. Now, as I told you at the time, as Bernie Sanders was informing us, because of the way that they structured this bill and because they did not include his many amendments that he was trying to add to it to basically get rid of a lot of the loopholes that were within this, there were essentially no guardrails that were put into this legislation, or at least not meaningful guardrails, to make sure that these gigantic billion-dollar, extremely profitable companies were actually going to be using the money that we were giving them for the things that this bill is in theory supposed to be doing. So I got a great breakdown here from the lever, Julia Rock. She says Intel's multi-billion-dollar bait and switch. So let's get into some of the details here. This shit is just absolutely wild. How, number one, again, predictable this was, but number two, how brazen they are about this entire process and just screwing over the American people via the money that we are giving them, essentially as a blank check. But she starts off saying, just a couple of months after Intel's multi-million-dollar lobbying effort to succeed in winning microchip companies billions of dollars in no-strings-attached corporate subsidies, Intel is reportedly planning to lay off thousands of workers. Okay, they say the potential layoffs come only weeks after the company announced a shareholder dividend at the same rate as the previous few quarters, amounting to a total of about $6 billion in annual dividends. So already, typical capitalist bullshit here, slashing some of your workforce, screwing over potentially thousands of people's lives in order to give out fatter dividends to your shareholders that, are already making tons of money off of this. And just as a point of reference here in terms of like Intel and their history on this, again here from the lever with more great reporting on the same exact thing, just some of the history. They say microchip companies like Intel are hardly cash-strapped that desperately need a bill providing $52 billion of federal subsidies in order to build factories in the United States. According to a study by the Institute for New Economic Thinking, Intel and four other wildly profitable American semiconductor giants that stand to benefit from this bill were so awash in cash that they spent nearly $250 billion in the last decade, $250 billion in the last decade, or 70% of their profits on stock buybacks. They say those stock buybacks diverted money from capital investments and into stock price boosts that enriched shareholders and executives. Intel and the microchip industry did this while moving manufacturing jobs away from the United States over the past 3 decades. So, I mean, listen, you look at the fundamental, just like basic situation that we are looking at right now in terms of why the United States is lagging behind countries like Taiwan, which produces a vast disproportionate amount of the global semiconductor supply that we use for our military equipment, that we use for our computers. Every piece of technology that you have and you use in your day-to-day life is reliant on this semiconductor technology. And you're just looking at this situation where the companies who are operating out of the United States, I mean, they have been spending decades, years, exporting jobs overseas, right? Getting some of these federal subsidies, spending billions and billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, right? $250 billion on stock buybacks purely to enrich their shareholders, 70% of their profits on stock buybacks, which should, by the way, just be completely fucking illegal because it's just, bumping up your stock price in an artificial way by restricting the amounts that are able to be purchased by actual, human beings, right? But 70% of their profits going towards stock buybacks. And what does that mean? That means that they were not spending that time bringing back manufacturing jobs here to the United States, right? Which many Democrats and Republicans consider this to be a national security issue, right? And they're spending 70% of their profits on stock buybacks purely for their shareholders, okay? Not for their workers, not to make these capital investments to actually improve their company at a fundamental level. It's like even at the, even at the grassroots of what it means to be pro-capitalist, right? This doesn't even make sense under their own framework of what this economic system should be doing, right? That's not productive. That's not making adequate investments to improve the fundamentals of your company. You're just enriching shareholders at the expense of $500 billion or $250 billion that could have been going into making some of these investments. And because they weren't making those investments, now we have the federal government through this CHIPS Act basically stepping in and trying to incentivize them to actually make those productive investments, which the company is refusing to do while they're exporting those jobs overseas and paying out to their shareholders via dividends. And, the federal government then steps in and says, okay, we'll give you basically a $52 billion blank check to, go and hopefully invest at least a little bit here in the United States. I mean, it's just a complete fucking joke. If you actually consider this to be a national security issue in regards to semiconductors, then fucking nationalize these companies. I mean, nationalize the production of these instead of just allowing these extremely profitable companies to just use all of this money that could be spent on manufacturing semiconductors on enriching their own shareholders. I mean, it's just a completely, ridiculous situation that this type of bill would even be needed, okay, while these companies are spending all of this money on all of this other various shit instead of actually improving the thing that this bill was intended to do. But now we get the additional slap in the face here. They say the sequence of events confirms warnings about the so-called CHIPS Act from a vanishingly small number of critics who cautioned that without the changes, the legislation would let companies use the money to finance payouts to wealthy investors. That's exactly what we're seeing them doing, and would not obligate the companies to expand their investments in domestic jobs. He says, and yet, those critics were ignored by politicians and pundits of both parties eager to shovel federal money to a handful of powerful tech companies. Indeed, when Senator Bernie Sanders, who was one of the only voices who was even coming out with these critiques, when he attempted to attach conditions to the subsidies, including, and these are some amazing provisions and amendments here that would have actually made this a very solid bill, right? In theory, I agree with this bill. We should be investing significantly more in domestic semiconductor manufacturing, but imagine if we had had all of these amendments that were actually added to it. He said he wanted to include a ban on stock buybacks. Okay, already we see exactly what they're spending their money on and what they have been for years now. That would have been great. A cap on executive pay. Again, amazing. They say a government equity stake, right? So if the American people are going to give tens of billions of dollars to these semiconductor companies that are already making tens of billions of dollars on an annual basis, maybe we should get a little bit of an ownership stake within these companies, right? That's only fair. We're not just going to give you free money to hopefully incentivize you to bring back some of these jobs to the United States when we could just be taking control of these companies, at least in proportion to the amount of money that we are giving them to do that, right? So that would have also been, an amazing amendment to add. I think that would have been probably the best of any of these. And he also wanted to add a union neutrality provision to basically say that, companies that are going to be accepting this money, you're not allowed to engage in illegal union busting tactics. You're not allowed to try to aggressively dissuade your workers from forming unions. Again, all of these amendments that he was trying to add would have made this bill a million times worse. But instead, you had corporate Democrats aligning with Republicans in order to give them all of these loopholes to continue allowing them to do what they've been doing for years, which is not actually going to be making the most efficient or significant investments in the thing that this entire fucking bill is supposed to be about, right? So they finish off here saying that at the time, Democrats blocking Sanders' initiative were bolstered by Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger, who insisted that if the legislation did not pass immediately, the company could move factories overseas and hold up already planned investments. Okay, so this is just a little bit of an insight, okay, a perfect glimpse into how rotten and corrupt our political system is, where you have, on the one hand, a politician like Bernie Sanders introducing some very, basic common sense amendments that would have secured this piece of legislation to actually do what it says that it's supposed to be doing. And then on the flip side of that, you have the CEO of one of these billion-dollar companies basically saying, or basically threatening Congress and saying, if you don't pass this bill right now, as it stands, without these amendments that Bernie Sanders was trying to add, then we're just going to export more jobs overseas, right? We are not going to make these investments. I mean, we are literally so cucked to the corporate private sector that it's embarrassing. I mean, the fact that you have a CEO who is able to apply more pressure on this piece of legislation so that he can keep getting away with what they've been doing over the last number of years, right? Putting at risk the national security, which is what Democrats and Republicans talk about semiconductors as, then, this is just a completely absurd political system, right? This is not a democracy. This is not something where what's in the best interest of even our own national security, or what's in the best interest of the workers at these companies, or the American people more broadly, or the stable security of our, production of these semiconductors for the future. It's not in the best interest of any of those. It's in the best interest of motherfuckers like this, Pat Gelsinger, the CEO of Intel. I mean, it's just a fucking joke at this point. But they finish off here saying, when lawmakers ultimately passed the bill in July, Intel abruptly began changing its rhetoric about the new domestic investments. That very same day, the company announced that it was cutting cutting back on capital spending by billions of dollars, but still intended to issue a strong and growing dividend for shareholders. So again, this is what this is all about. I mean, you look at just what this capitalist system that we have right now in the United States is built to do, right? It is not built for these companies to make better productive investments within their companies or within their workers, or to improve, prices for the American people, and to get people cheap products, which was sort of like the promise of neoliberalism, right? We're going to export all of these jobs overseas. We're going to hollow out the manufacturing base here, but don't worry, you're going to be getting cheap commodities, right? And now we're left with a situation where all of these companies, their sole priority, I mean, this is baked within, their arrangements with shareholders. They have a legal obligation to maximize the amount that they are delivering to their shareholders, and that comes at the expense of all of these other things that even under a capitalist mode of production would make much more sense in terms of improving the outcomes of this company, right? If you're spending tens of billions of dollars or $250 billion over the last decade on stock buybacks, you're not making those investments in, productive capital investments to increase your production. You're not making those investments in your workers. You're not making those investments in bringing back some of these factories here to the United States. You're just doing it purely for the sake of enriching your wealthy shareholders on Wall Street. I mean, it's just, at this point, I don't even know what to say about this. I mean, maybe potentially there are going to be some factories that are built. In all likelihood, it's going to take years and years and years to get them up and running. And by the time that we actually have some of them up and running, they're already going to be lagging significantly behind corporations like TSMC, the Taiwanese corporation, who's making far more and far larger investments within their own semiconductor productive capabilities in that country. So it's like, by the time we even get these up and running, they're not even going to be at the point where we need them to be in terms of like being on the leading edge of semiconductor manufacturing and the technology that goes in to all of these key products that we use on a day-to-day basis, and which again, the U.S. military even relies on in order to maintain their equipment, in order to continue building the weapons that we build in this country. So it's like, from any perspective you want to look at this, whether it's from the broader prospects of the American economy, whether it's from the perspective of the workers who actually are manufacturing these and working here in the United States, whether it's from the perspective of even the military industrial complex, this piece of legislation was not geared towards appeasing any of those interests, right? It wasn't geared towards actually maximizing the help that the American people could be getting from a bill like this. It was purely centered with all of these loopholes around serving the needs of CEOs like that guy Pat Gelsinger from Intel, and serving the needs of the shareholders at this company.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying